Welcome to the Northern Outer Banks Podcast. From wild horses to small town legends, this is where stories, history, nature, and everyday life come together. Each episode is a front porch conversation with the people and places that give this stretch of North Carolina its soul. Whether you've been coming here for years or just found it on a map, pull up a chair. You're in for a good story. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Northern Outer Banks Podcast. I'm your host, Miles Daniels, and today I am privileged to be joined by local author, historian, philanthropist, and president of Twiddy & Company on the Northern Outer Banks, Clark Twiddy. Clark, Miles, it is a privilege to have you here this morning.
Well, the privilege is mine. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. So, Clark, broadly, we'd like to spend the majority of this conversation talking about the evolution of the visitor economy on the Outer Banks, more specifically the Northern Outer Banks. But your family has been a pivotal part of that story. And to give it some context, I think it's important to talk about 1978, 47 years ago. Your mother and father, Doug and Sharon Twiddy, were one of the early visionaries who saw what was possible. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that story.
Well, I very much appreciate those comments. I think Mom and Dad would say that they were fortunate to be in the place that began to evolve and emerge at the right time, and they would be the first to say that their success is a credit to the people around them, and so I think we need to point that out. But having said that, to your point, Dad started a small real estate office in Duck, North Carolina. Its most prominent feature was an oyster shucking table, and people would come eat oysters with Dad, and that same table exists, and they would talk, and they would say, "Hey, Doug, I just bought a house, and I need your help renting it to help me pay for it, and maybe I could even offset some expenses." And Mom and Dad started a company with 4 homes. At that time, Duck had 7 children. My brother and sister were 3 of the 7. And over time, as the place evolved and emerged and grew, we were fortunate to grow along with them.
So Duck, for context, being just south of Corolla. So at what point did the business move from Duck north to Corolla, and what's the history of that?
There was a pivotal moment. There's a community in North Duck called North Point. And at one time, this community was an airstrip. And a gentleman named Dick Brindley, who was a retired AT&T executive, came to Duck with the vision to start a restaurant. And he and my father met and began to talk, and Dick changed his vision to create a subdivision of purpose-built vacation rental homes, and that community still exists today. And you know it because there was an indoor pool out by the road. And Duck Road at that time was very rustic, but the pool was designed to get people to pull into the community. Fast forward a few years, Corolla's just to the north, much cheaper real estate, and essentially 3 things happened at that time. Number one, Jimmy Carter interest rates peaked in the late Carter administration, somewhere around 21, 22%. Reagan comes in, reelected. Part of his platform is reducing interest rates. In about 1985, interest rates had been cut in half, were 8% moving down from that. So there was an incentive. When interest rates decline, savers are penalized, borrowers are rewarded. So there was an incentive. Number 2, we have the phenomenon of Mark Bass Knight, the incredibly powerful North Carolina politician who begins his rise in Norfolk. His rise was predicated in many cases on transportation and his ability to direct appropriations in Raleigh for transportation. In our case, that meant a paved road to Corolla, which was surprisingly late in coming, but Mark Bass Knight made it happen. So we have an incentive, and then we have infrastructure. And with that, now we need risk takers. Enter, once again, Dick Brindley, who in 1984 buys 240 acres, ocean to sound, from a group in Virginia Beach for about $3.5 million, which at that time was an enormous amount of money. To put that in context, an oceanfront home in Corolla Light recently sold for that amount.
Wow.
Having said that, he has a vision to create a subdivision, a resort in Corolla that has incredible levels of amenity. He puts the oceanfront pool right on the ocean as opposed to the road because he had learned from North Point, put the pool on the ocean. and builds houses around that, it is a enormous success. And that happened in roughly 1985, 1986. That moment was a pivotal moment for the Northern Outer Banks because it brought a level of sophistication, of grandeur, of quality to what was emerging as a vacation home destination that was never seen before, and arguably has not been seen since. But to put that in context, and don't quote me on the exact numbers, in 1982, for example, roughly 400 homes in what I'll call the Northern Outer Banks. Today, thousands. To put it in specific context, about 10 years later, so we go from 1982 to about 1992, about 2,000 homes. So imagine standing on that freshly paved road with interest rates declining, with lumber trucks headed north in big convoys to build those new homes. Once people saw that Corolla Light would work and take off, then that was the proverbial dam that had been busted in terms of investment, and the Currituck Outer Banks would never be the same. And enter the visitor economy.
Let's talk about the visitor economy. What does that look like? I know North Carolina, I think I have my facts straight here, number 5 in terms of most popular visitor destination in the country.
Yes.
Second only Orlando, Texas, some of the larger states, which are obvious. A thriving visitor economy across North Carolina, but a lot of that hinges on the coastal communities, including the Outer Banks. So let's talk about what do you mean when you say visitor economy as opposed to, say, tourism, which I think feels very transactional. These are our guests. Mm-hmm. You're in the business of hospitality, guest experience. It's not transactional. So what do we mean when we broadly say visitor economy? And what impacts does that have both, in terms of not just tourism, but local communities? There's a trickle-down effect there.
Absolutely. I think in North Carolina particularly, I agree with you. I believe the 5th most visited state. To put a financial component to that, visitors in North Carolina spend roughly $100 million a day in North Carolina. That generates about $8 million a day to the state in the form of tax revenue. So no matter how you measure it, tourism, the visitor economy at a statewide level, one of our biggest economic drivers is a state. That's even more amplified when we begin to approach the coast because we don't have diversified economies like perhaps Charlotte might, perhaps Raleigh-Durham, Wilmington to an extent. So that visitor economy, and I like that word better because I think tourism has a transient nature to it. It's even acquired in some cases a negative connotation. I think the visitor economy is a much more holistic phrase because it reflects the direct levels of visitor engagement, but also the indirect benefits in areas like restaurants, retail, real estate, housing, education, healthcare. All of those things are interacting with the visitor economy either directly or indirectly. So I think the visitor economy is a more appropriate term because it reflects the community at large rather than the simple transactions from a customer to, for example, a vacation rental manager, a restaurant. It's more inclusive, and I think it tells much better story.
I'd love to just talk about, I think is it 1,200 homes now that Twiddy & Company manages across the Outer Banks, but in large part on the Northern Outer Banks, Corolla, the 4x4. Let's talk a little bit about seasonality. We think of the Outer Banks as a summer destination, but that has changed over the years. How has tourism itself, the visitor economy itself, the guests who visit the Outer Banks, the Northern Outer Banks, how has that changed over the years in terms of, I know we're obviously popular with families.
Very much so.
So we have multi-generations who come back year after year, but how has that evolved? How has the guest sort of profile changed, if at all, over the years on the Outer Banks?
The Outer Banks has always been, remarkably, very much a family destination. Outside of Orlando, I think the Outer Banks is widely acknowledged as one of the vacation rental capitals, not only of North Carolina, but of America, in terms of the share of residence and lodging, in terms of lodging options available. Vacation homes are a surprising preponderance as compared to inns, hotels that you might see in other coastal destinations like, for example, Rehoboth Beach, Myrtle Beach, some of those other areas. So I think it's unique in terms of what it offers to the public. The Outer Banks has always been a blue-collar beach. We are Virginia, Pennsylvania. We are a day's drive from 60% of the population of the United States. Practically, I think most of our visitors come on one tank of gas, and they spend money on I-64 and 460, and tourism on the Outer Banks reflects into Virginia as well. And how it's evolved, I think particularly the Northern Outer Banks is very fortunate. I think I've heard the number 20% of the visitors to the Northern Outer Banks have visited more than 20 times. And that suggests very much a family tradition that I think a lot of other destinations would envy in terms of that level of engagement. Now, obviously, we love our longtime repeat visitors. Sometimes I'll even call them our seasonal residents. We also love our first-time visitors because we believe they're starting a tradition. So we have folks all across that tradition scale and spectrum, and hopefully we're able to offer a consistent experience to the folks that have visited more than 20 times or the young family who's visiting for their first time. To your point, what's changed, I think, is the numbers of people because of the quality of the experience has been referred up and across neighborhoods all across Virginia and Pennsylvania. And yet what stayed the same, I hope, is the fundamental of a very unique natural environment, a tank of gas away from what is a growing demographic base in our core markets. Pittsburgh is the most popular city to visit the Outer Banks, and that, again, emphasizes that Virginia, Pennsylvania connection to the Outer Banks.
One of the stories that we've talked about off camera that I love is you and your brother Ross, starting with your parents, had a long history on the weekends. That's known as changeover.
Yes.
Primarily on Saturday, changeover day. We'll talk about that. But greeting guests, opening doors for guests, really showing Southern hospitality in its best light. A lot of that changed during, let's say, 2020, starting with COVID. And
Yes.
We'll talk about this term digitizing Southern hospitality. But one of the things we've talked about in the past that I love is you said you can tell a lot about the guests who arrive from their bumper stickers, from their T-shirts. A lot of folks listening own businesses. They're in the business of customer experience. I think that's really interesting. What did you mean by that? What are some of the things that you look at when you're greeting guests and creating that customer experience?
I think we're very fortunate to hopefully know, and we have wonderful competitors. So we're very proud of what we've been able to do in terms of a team, but we have great competitors as well. So I think that's one of the areas that has made the Currituck Outer Banks unique, is an incredibly competitive environment that brings a lot of value to homeowners and particularly visitors. But to your point, we know, hopefully, folks not only as data points and as trends and as market cycles, but we also know them as people. And the best way to know them as people in many cases is to anonymously watch them arrive and depart. And if we listen, they'll tell us exactly what they want, exactly where they're coming from, what their expectation is. And one of my favorite quotes, Robert Caro, who wrote the great LBJ biography, said, "If you ask the right question, there's always more to the story." So we get to see the bumper stickers that they proudly display on their car and the sports jerseys, a lot of Capitals jerseys, Orioles jerseys. We get to see the food wrappers that spill out of their car after a long ride, and we know where they've stopped on 460 and I-64, and we can tell by how they stretch when they get out of the car how long they've been in the car. We can tell if they get out on a July day with a sweatshirt, they've had the AC on for hours and they're cold. And a lot of those things are nonverbal, but we can get an immediate understanding and have a lot of empathy for someone in the first 10 seconds watching their arrival and then watching their departure. We can see the sunburn lines. We can see the smiles. We can watch how long the goodbye hugs take. Sometimes they're quick. Sometimes they go on for 30 minutes, and we know how their stay went. And oftentimes it's the smile that we see that is our best indicator on a repeat visit. So we're fortunate to be able to watch those folks, hopefully as they create memories for their family that will last a lifetime.
And like we said, so many of those folks are coming back year after year, and that's the beauty of the Outer Banks. And as folks are driving down on a given weekend, and again, primarily Saturday is what we call changeover day, and there's a window between 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. as folks are driving down where a whole army of inspectors and cleaners enough that it caught the attention 20 years ago of the New York Times and was featured in the New York Times and featured also Twiddy and Company as part of that story. What does that look like on changeover day? I mean, you think about the number of bedrooms across 1,200 homes. I don't know I think the average size of a hotel is 100 rooms. So if you look at that as it relates to how many hotels even that you're cleaning between that 6-hour window on a Saturday, what does changeover day look like for a vacation rental management company?
The Outer Banks continues to be unique to your point in that the great majority of our visitors are coming for 1 week. Now, that's different than a lot of other destinations, and there is some demography evolving in the United States that suggests smaller vacations, particularly for 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and that demographic. The Outer Banks continues, for the most part, to buck that trend. And what that means is most of the Outer Banks is arriving and departing on Saturday and Sunday. These are hundreds of thousands of people. Our average cleaner, for example, drives 84 miles one way to arrive. And to your point, the level of effort and complexity that is occurring on the Outer Banks on Saturday and Sunday is gargantuan. From cleaning homes to changing linens to updating maintenance to making sure that pools and spas and restaurants have deliveries. And all of that is going on in about 4 hours, maybe 6, maybe 8. But for the most part, it's 4. It's 10 to 2. And it's an incredible thing to watch. And it's never perfect. This is, above all, a human business. Until robots either come on vacation or robots can clean homes, this is a human business. And it contains a lot of other things, but it's wrapped up in humanity. And it's just an amazing thing to watch. Now, the good news there is many of these organizations on the Outer Banks have been doing this, to your point, for decades. So what you're seeing is, in some cases, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of experience in terms of how to do these things conducted. My analogy is a symphony on Saturday and Sunday. No matter the weather, no matter the trend, the show must go on. So it's a little bit of Broadway. It's a little bit of emptying trash cans at scale. It's a little bit of engineering. It's a little bit of trading. It's a little bit of sweat. But all designed to make sure that that guest experience is flawless. We believe that a guest visiting the Outer Banks obviously should get the same hospitality in May that they get in August. It sounds easy. It's actually very difficult to do. Anybody can do something one time, but the key is that consistency of experience that we think is one of the hallmarks of the Outer Banks.
Around March of 2020, in essence, the world shut down. We all went into quarantine. Companies like yours were facing, on the Outer Banks, we're very resilient. We've weathered a lot of storms over the course of our history. This was a different kind of storm, COVID, that had a significant impact on the visitor economy. Ended up being a very positive impact, but in terms of companies like yours, you had to pivot very quickly. And that's where the term digitizing Southern hospitality, you can no longer open those doors and greet your guests on the weekend. Let's talk about that COVID period. How did that change the visitor economy on the Outer Banks? And then maybe talk a little bit about, I love how you're using data and artificial intelligence in a very effective way so that it's still personal to the guest. But that, in large part, I think came and stemmed from what you experienced during that COVID period. So let's start there. Starting March of 2020, what did that look like? Let's paint a picture, because a lot of our guests visited that year. And
I think so many people have experiences, if we go back to 2020, when the world was born anew. One of my favorite book titles, The Warmth of Other Suns. The COVID sun meant a whole new world for so many of us, and particularly businesses across the world that were rooted, as tourism and the visitor economy is, in human interaction, had an existential and immediate crisis. How do we continue to deliver people the best memories of their lives when we can no longer interact with them? How can we clean their homes with certainty and safety? How do we keep the service providers who are doing that on behalf of visitors in a safe environment? So clearly, we learned more as an industry in about a month in early 2020 than we probably had in the preceding 10 years. Part of it was just refusing not to quit. We're going to figure this out. Part of it is the vulnerability and the humility to say we have no idea what's coming next. And then most importantly, we had, I believe, the trust of visitors who loved the Outer Banks and didn't know what to expect on their own vacation, but were willing to believe that the Outer Banks would be there for them as we knew more about the pandemic. So I think those three things really began to change everything. And then obviously, we're also in the midst of a technological revolution, whether it's smartphones, whether it's apps, whether it's technology. I go back to tell my daughters who are 9 and 5, at one point we had these weird things called envelopes, and we would stick these little things called stamps on them, and we would walk them down to a blue box, and maybe a month later we would get a letter in return from that. And it was this odd thing that we did, and we used a pen on something called paper, and we wrote. And now we have virtually unlimited forms of communication that are practically costless. So we had to use that technology to make sure that we were still able to be thoughtful and graceful around folks who were considering and arriving for a vacation in a way that felt personal, while still acknowledging the fact that we were simply unable to either greet them in person or really give any assurance of what to expect on their vacation. So like so many folks all around the world, that was a very dynamic time. Interestingly, no one that I'm aware of could have predicted what was going to happen to the Outer Banks when we began to emerge from what I'll say is the most critical phase of the pandemic. Call it May, June, July of 2020. The Outer Banks saw what is an absolutely astonishing level of interest in not only coming on vacation, but owning real estate. So you go from an environment that is a paucity of a visitor economy, and then very quickly on the other side of that, you transition to what is abundance is probably an understatement, a shocking amount of interest in the Outer Banks. So you have a challenge of how to deal with plenty and then how to deal with nothing almost simultaneously.
Clark, as I mentioned in the introduction, you wear many hats, one of which is the author of two books that focus on the history of the Outer Banks, specifically in Memories of the Currituck Outer Banks, the Northern Outer Banks, as told by a gentleman named Ernie Bowden, Amazon best-selling book. Who was Ernie Bowden, and how does he fit into the larger story of the Northern Outer Banks? But fascinating read. What does the Northern Outer Banks look like from Ernie's perspective, and what drew you to write this book?
Well, I'm humble about my own contributions. My parents told me that humility suited me very well because I had a lot to be humble about. But I was fortunate that I had great characters. Ernie, first and foremost, is a great character. He was notable in that he had what I believe was a unique perspective on the Currituck Outer Banks. His father was born on the Northern Outer Banks in the year of 1903, the same year as the Wright brothers. And it doesn't take a ton of imagination to view the Currituck Outer Banks in 1903 as not separate from a moonscape. And in his lifetime, he can remember his father in 1903, and Ernie's family are multi-generational on the Currituck Outer Banks. And then all of a sudden during his lifetime, he watches the explosion and the transformation of the Currituck Outer Banks into something that, frankly, his ancestors and father probably could not have imagined. And sometimes we joke, I think Ernie would have been less surprised to see aliens land on the beach and get out. That would not have shocked him as much as seeing what the economy brought forth onto the Currituck Outer Banks. And he had an absolutely unique perspective in that. He was an elected official for many years. He was a businessman. He was a livestock operator. He would describe himself as a cattleman. He had the last cattle brand on the Northern Outer Banks. And he passed away in his late 90s, but with a memory that was razor sharp. So we're happy to get that story and some of his recollections out there. And the reason we think they're so timely is because, going back to the earlier point about an explosion of the visitor economy on the Outer Banks, when we see that explosion, we first, to interpret that, have to understand how we got to that point. So if you want to know where do we go from here, to me, the first question is not where do we go, but how did we get here? It's only context that tells that story. And candidly, Ernie probably had more context than anybody. That's
a great question because during the COVID years, as we'll call them, Twiddy and Company forged a partnership with North Carolina State University, specifically with Dr. Whitney Nolenberg, well known in the state as in terms of her professionalism as it relates to tourism. No one knows it better, arguably, in terms of a researcher at least. What do we mean by sustainability? Why is that important, going back to, no one could have imagined, and then looking forward to the next 5 or 10 years? Responsible tourism, we hear that a lot, sustainability. How do you define that, and what does that mean to community, to environment, et cetera, as it relates to the visitor economy?
I think one of the lessons we took away from the pandemic, like so many others, was our surprising inability as an industry, as a company, to really see around corners. So one of the things we took away from that is, how do we broaden the tent, for lack of a better phrase, and develop best practices around sustainability? Sustainability in this case doesn't necessarily mean traditionally green initiatives, things like that. Sustainability means, how does tourism and the visitor economy develop in such a way where it doesn't extract uniqueness from the community and erode the community? So at some point, an ironic thing happens when you lose what you had, and you will have not gotten what you wanted as a destination. And we recognize the risks of that. So we reached out to NC State and Dr. Nolenberg, because she had unique visibility into other communities that were experiencing similar challenges, whether that's Hawaii, whether that is other areas in the East Coast, whether that's in California. Those conversations are inevitably related at a local citizen level to things like education, to things like healthcare, to things like affordable housing. So rather than have to make our own original mistakes, we thought the best thing we could do was partner with a research university that would greatly enhance the ability of the industry and of the communities in our area to see around those proverbial corners in terms of zoning, in terms of economic development, in terms of workforce. And we think it's those conversations that will be the road ahead, and that the visitor economy will then travel upon.
Your second book, Outer Banks Visionaries, Building North Carolina's Ocean Front, the back jacket, you call it America's Seashore. And you say, like Walt Disney World or Las Vegas, the initial ideas around what is today a glittering vacation capital were at one point nothing more than a shared vision of what was possible. You mentioned Dick Brindley, your father, Senator Mark Bass-Knight, who was president pro tem of the Senate here in North Carolina on the infrastructure front. What would they think today? I mean, because so many of those individuals that you talk about were, 40 years ago in context of Senator Bass-Knight in the 80s into early 90s. I mean, what do you think, having written the book on the visionaries who saw what was possible? Is this what they imagined?
I don't think it's what they imagined. And I think if they were all sitting in a room, and I've heard several long-standing Outer Bankers say this, when we go back and critique, for example, zoning, or we lambast elected officials from an earlier generation at their lack of vision, several have pulled me aside and said, we agree with you. If we had it to do it all over again, we never would have made some of the decisions that we made. Ernie Bowden said that. I asked Ernie one time, do you have any regrets? And he said, of course I do. If I'd have known today what the Outer Banks would have become, I never would have done some of the things from an elected official perspective. Each of them has said, but, and what comes after the but is very interesting. You have to understand the environment that we grew up in, the remoteness, the relative poverty, the isolation. It was inconceivable to many of those folks that the Outer Banks today, 40 years after the birth of Corolla Light, would be a multi-billion-dollar, globally famous vacation destination. They would have been shocked to hear that. I think they would have been thrilled to know that their vision had come to life in such a way. I would point out that growth inevitably has lumpy impacts on citizenry. I would point out that while the visitor economy is certainly not perfect, and we have a long way to go to making sure that the benefits of the visitor economy are equally distributed throughout our communities, it would be hard to argue that the standard of living that residents of the Outer Banks enjoy today isn't exponentially improved from the standard of living from those residents, say, in the 60s or the 70s. So I think overwhelmingly the visitor economy has brought the standard of living on the Outer Banks to something that would have been equally as shocking to those early visionaries.
Clark, we're getting close in terms of time, and we could sit here and talk for hours about the positive impact that our guests have on the visitor economy, Outer Banks, Northern Outer Banks. So thank you for shedding light and giving us some context and history as it relates to the visitor economy. If you were planning, as a local Outer Banker, if you were planning the perfect vacation for a family to visit the Outer Banks, for you and your family, for example, what would that look like?
What a great question that is. I think the Outer Banks is unique in so many ways. I think first and foremost, we have to understand the nautical history and the nature of the Outer Banks. I would get out on the water in some way, and I would look back at that threadbare, narrow strip of sandbar that we call the Outer Banks and consider that in light of the natural environment that surrounds it. I think that's very important. We have wonderful seafood. We are close to wonderful agriculture. The food and freshness and uniqueness of some of the things we're able to enjoy is world class. I'd have a great meal. I would consider history, whether it's the Lost Colony, whether it's the Wright brothers, whether it's the history of the life-saving service, the predecessor to the modern-day Coast Guard. There's military history on the Outer Banks. The level of history on the Outer Banks is jaw-dropping when considered in whole. I'd go take in one of those historic moments. And most importantly, I would settle around, hopefully, a big dining room table with multiple generations, and I would look out across that group and hope that that moment in that wonderful place lived forever in my mind. And if that moment could be captured via the photograph, the camera in your mind, and lives there, you've experienced the Outer Banks.
Clark Twiddy, best-selling author, historian, president of Twiddy & Company, one of several vacation rental management companies on the Northern Outer Banks. Thank you so much for being with us today on the Northern Outer Banks podcast.
Thank your listeners, too. It's a joy to be able to talk about this. We look forward to welcoming everyone to the Outer Banks, and we're excited. I think we're embarking on yet another golden age for the Outer Banks, and it's a pleasure to even be a small part of it.
Here, wild horses roam windswept beaches, and the ocean stretches endlessly before you. Each sunrise brings a new adventure. Each breeze carries the salt and serenity of the sea. Climb our historic red brick lighthouse. Savor fresh seafood and North Carolina barbecue. This is more than a vacation. It's a place that renews your spirit and keeps calling you back. Where in the Outer Banks? Only in the Northern Outer Banks.